everyone, Xanderro Gaming coming at you with another video, and Demonslayer is in the Union Arena trading card game, and with that means that we got a lot of new decks that we get to build and play around with and test against some of the other IPs that are in the game, which is a really cool, exciting thing. This is going to be a doozy of a video. I'm going to try to get through it kind of quick, but still make some good points. But I'm going to try to take most of the decks that we know can be built out of the Demonslayer set and kind of put them on a chart, a tier list, kind of deck ranking. I don't really want to call it a tier list as much as like trying to like put decks into a space where like it shows how like competitive they are. So tier list, competitive ranking, complete deck ranking, whatever you want to call it, it's just a tier list. And I just kind of want to, you know, give my thoughts on where I think some of these Demonslayer decks can compare to the other amazing decks that we have in the Union Arena trading card game. So with that being said, let's just talk about how I want to format this one. And we're going to have meta, which will be, you know, all the decks that are huge meta contending decks, meaning that these are decks that top in tournaments pretty often or that are really, really strong. And there's usually one of these from each of the sets. I will say a lot of people were disappointed when they saw the current list for, you know, Demonslayer when it got released to come here, because they thought a lot of the decks maybe were just not as competitive as decks as compared to what we got from the Code Geass. But I think a lot of people have to understand that the Code Geass set and the JJK set, for instance, just had so many really strong competitive decks that having, you know, every set live up to that expectation is just not, you know, realistic, okay? Those two sets are amazing, and they show to this day with their placings in the Japanese format with how strong those decks are. But that does not mean that all the Demonslayer decks are not good. There's a couple in there in this set that I do think are really strong and will shake up the meta in Union Arena. So it's a strong set. It is a fun set. I do think that a lot of the decks are a lot more cohesive as opposed to a lot of the first decks that we got in some of the other sets. I think that all these decks can be played, other than one deck out of them I think is a kind of a mess, maybe two, but they are good decks. It should be a set that you're excited about, and if you love Demonslayer, don't let that deter you other people saying that these decks aren't as good, because they can be. You just have to take the time with any deck, and if you learn your matchups, you can do well with it. But we have the meta decks, like I said. Those would be the ones that just place in tournaments. You know, tier 1 after that will be the decks I think that are complete decks. They're really good, strong decks. They maybe could use a little help, but not really. They also top in tournaments, and they're really, really strong decks. After that will be like, you know, 1.5. I wanted to say like cusp of being like, you know, a tournament winning deck or a deck that's really, really solid. But really these three tiers right here are your decks that are, you know, kind of complete, really good decks. The ones kind of getting lower to 1 and 2, 1.5 means they're probably missing a couple pieces here or there to make them really, really strong. But definitely, you know, meta, I'd imagine most decks will be in this 1.5 tier right here. Tier 2 just being decks that I think do have a lot of help, but just are not as strong, but very playable. 1.5 and 2 are probably going to have the most decks in it, crammed into it, because I do think that Union Arena has done a great job of making a lot of very playable decks. If you like a certain character and it's in a set, chances are that you can make a deck with it and do pretty decently with it. So I like that the card game has done this so far for a lot of, you know, if you're a fan of something, you can build a deck. I do think that there's a lot of very playable, cohesive decks. Now, granted, you know, tournament winning high tier meta decks, not as many, but if you're just wanting to play the card game, this list is a little bit more for you, where I kind of like, you know, kind of place the decks. I'm going through all the decks, and the need help down here is just decks that I don't feel are very cohesive, or maybe, you know, didn't get released with enough to make them somewhat playable, or maybe that they're just really hard to build, and maybe they need help from the community to make them, you know, better playable decks. But with that being said, this is all the decks that I've tried to get from every set. If I missed a deck here, please forgive me. I try to do my research on any deck that I saw listed that could be a deck, like, you know, I don't know. Like, I try to get everything I could on this list. And like I said, this is going to be a huge list, but I try to get everything that had support from each set. I took the main cards from those and put them on here so that way we can say that they have their own decks. Now, whether those decks can be mixed together, I'm not really going into too much details of that. The main one being like, Blue JJK is just going to be, this right here, all the different reiterations of it with the, the Nanami or Yuji, however you want to do it. Just kind of one deck, but I'm trying to tackle this task of, giving you all these decks. So if I miss something, please forgive me, but please comment it in the comments. Please tell me what I missed, what you think is not on here, but I try to do my best with that. But since we're already on the topic of it, the meta, we are definitely just going to go ahead and put Blue JJK, dependent. I did separate the builds, trying to, be discriminative about these two. They're both just Blue JJK decks, but yes, they are meta top tier decks for sure. These decks are really, really strong in the Union Arena trading card game. So I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm not trying to do a detailed breakdown, tier list ranking of competitive decks. I'm just trying to give you a, full acclamation of all the decks. And these two kind of builds of the decks are definitely top tier competitive decks. If you want to play those, that's definitely up there for you. We'll kind of try to touch one from each category. So with that being said, we'll go to another meta deck from a different set. That was JJK. We'll go on to Kogias, and the purple Kogias is definitely a top tier meta deck in the card game. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. This deck is really, really good, but I do want to talk about a different build of the deck, which is a purple build of the deck that is running, more of the 2-drop, 2 action point Lelouches and the 2-drop action point of the C2. This deck is really cool in the way that it controls your opponent's board, and you get some value with playing the 2-cost characters. And this deck is really cool. It is a complete deck, so I will put it up here in the tier 1 because it does also run the Gawain, but I did want to make the description of that is a little different. Let me make myself a little smaller. There we go. Sorry, didn't think that y'all could see that. Perfect, right there. Now, keep going on here. That's where that one is. Let's see. We'll take a hunter deck. Let's go with Gone and Friends. I like this deck a lot. I don't think that it needs help. This is one of my favorite decks. I love Hunter. It's my favorite set. I've spent a lot of time with all these decks in here. Other than Bomber, I have a couple friends that play Bomber. Are really cool. I do think that this is a cohesive deck and it has a lot going on. I think it just doesn't do a absolute ton, but I get a lot of wins with this deck. I know, granted, it's at my locals, but if you're not prepared for, the BP boost that Gong gets to do, he can put you over. And I do think that he's a semi-complete deck. He is pretty strong. I think a lot of people sleep on this deck because everyone just wants to play Kurapika. And that's understandable because Kurapika is, proven itself as a top-tier meta deck. And since we're already talking about it, we'll just go ahead and throw him up there. Kurapika is a meta deck, top-tier deck. Get these out of the way. Don't want to spend too much time on those. But I do think that Gone is a solid deck. If you want to build Gone and Friends, it's a cohesive, playable deck. You could probably do really well with it at your locals. Going down, we'll touch on another JJK deck. We will go... We're already on him. I feel like I'm going to get a lot of flack for this because this deck, it did just, top recently in a big tournament. But it is not a meta deck. I think it is, to be honest, a deck that honestly needs help. I think it just does well into some of the meta stuff, and I'm really happy that Gojo has done really well. Don't get me wrong, I love this deck too, but it doesn't feel so cohesive and like it has everything it needs yet, which is a great thing if you are a Gojo player because it means that later on you are getting more support, and this deck is going to be really, really good. But I do think it is a solid deck in the Union Arena trading card game. You can do a lot with this deck. I think it's a little slower, but it does have a great top end. Really fun deck. Definitely going in the 1.5 tier. Super great deck. And I feel bad putting it here because it has topped in tournaments, but I don't think that that means it's going to consistently do that. But, I'm trying to give everyone, this is not a, meta tier list breakdown of what I just want to try to place all the decks with, I think, how playable they are in the card game and what you can do with them. And Gojo is a good deck that you can build. It does need a little work, but it is a strong deck. Going on to our first Demon Slayer deck. A lot of people are torn what they think is the best deck in Demon Slayer. I personally think that it is this deck. I think that it is Daki and Gyutaru. I think that this deck is really strong. It has a lot of support. There's a lot of, 0, 1, 2, 3 up your chain, which is what you want to see in consistency in a deck. It's really strong. It can swing. It has a way to recur itself on the board. It's a really strong deck, and I think that it ties, we'll go into it now with the Demon Slayer. I think it ties Tanjiro and Nezuko with, being able to push the pace of a game. These are two really strong, awesome decks in the card game. You should be really excited if you built one of these two decks in Demon Slayer. I promise you, they are both really good, strong decks. And these are the two decks that I think can compete with the top tier meta decks in the Union Arena trading card game. I probably should have saved these for last because these are probably the two, but that's just how it naturally came along. These two are amazing in the game. I promise you, if you build these two decks, you could take them to a big tournament and do really, really well with them. With that being said, I'm going to drop this Lelouch down here behind these two because it is a little slower, not as fast as some of these other decks, but it is a cool deck because it gets to abuse the Gawain. But yeah, these two decks, really, really strong. Be on the lookout in maybe the next big tournament to see some people deciding to take these two decks because they're really fun. Let's touch on some bleach. We'll go down and we're just going to put yellow bleach down here in the need some help. These two decks, they are cool decks, and I think they do have a lot of support, but they just don't have a ton of showings. I really don't know what to say about these decks too much. I haven't had a lot of experience playing with them. I don't see a lot of people playing with these decks. When I randomly do see someone playing with these decks, I think they're really cool, but they obviously need some help if people aren't wanting to play with them, if they don't feel like they can win games with these decks, if they feel like they're just not worth spending their time on to try to master the decks. So I know that's not very comprehensive in giving you guys what I usually do, but we need to see more people playing with the decks, and I'm sad to put these down here because I know a lot of people love Bleach, and they are cool decks, but they obviously need some help in the card game, and I hope that they do. I try not to look too far into the future of Union Arena with the sets that are coming out, but I hope they do get more support coming up because they just don't, even at locals, I never see them, topping our locals. Let's go back in reverse, though. Let's go into another of the Demon Slayer, since this is the newest set and where we want to place them. And depending on how you want to say this deck, I know some people, go full in with the Inosuke and Zenitsu, but I think the combination of these two together is where you really want to be with this deck. And it is a really cool, solid deck. I think it can do really strong, powerful things. I don't think that it has a strong enough top end and consistency as maybe these two decks, to where I think that these two decks are lacking a little bit of that. But you could throw in, some other red good cards like the Rengokus and stuff like that. But it is a really strong, awesome deck. And like I said, a lot of these hunter decks are complete or not hunter decks, but Demon Slayer decks are complete decks that I think can compete in the Union Arena trading card game. Maybe not against the meta top tier decks all the way, but it is a good deck. I think that if you took it to the tournament, you should be happy about how it performs and really strong. And that's what this 1.5 tier is kind of for, where the decks are good, complete, strong decks. You may not always win a tournament with them, but you can play the game and you'll have fun, and they do cool things for sure. Going reverse up through, we'll go back to JJK, and let's do my boy Toto. I like Toto a lot, and this feels bad because I think that Toto can do some really cool things, but he needs a little help. I'll put him here because he is a cohesive deck. So that, with that being said, like I said, I'm not trying to make this so much of a tier list as like I think playable good decks for the Union Arena trading card game. And he's along the lines of these decks where he does have a strategy that you're trying to do. I do think it's fleshed out really well. He can bring out, the Kyoto package to bring out and flood the board. He has a lot of damage and impact that he can put. He can manipulate your opponent's energy lines. So if you like decks that kind of do it all, this deck is one of the decks for you. I like this deck a lot. It's one of my favorite decks to play. Maybe start resituating some of these a little bit. I can't help it. I'm trying not to be so serious about it, but I do think that if I had to do it, I think that these two are probably a little more consistent and better, but regardless, they're all in the same tier, kind of like really good solid decks in the game that you could play, that you could do really well with and have fun with. All right, going up to Hunter needs help. Silva, Zoldit family, one of my favorite, it's just Hunter. I love all the Hunter decks, but this deck, it needs help, big time. It's just needs another raid target other than the, you know, I'm blanking on his name, but I love him. It only has one raid card that you can use in it. And, you know, even though that the Big Daddy Zoldit comes out, and he is a very intimidating figure and a very powerful card, the deck's just not fast enough. It doesn't have enough, you know, and power or any way to kind of like stall your opponent out to give you a chance in the game. So he needs help. I like it a lot. I do think there's room to make this deck work, and it just doesn't feel like it is such a complete deck to where it flows very naturally. Going into the Code Geass, and a lot of these decks will go into Lancelot. It is a top tier deck. It's a meta deck, super strong and powerful. If you decide to build this deck from the Code Geass set, you will have a great time in your locals, in big tournaments. It is a meta top tier deck. Not a lot to say about that one. We will touch on another one though, the Britannia deck. I think that this is a deck that is built out. It doesn't have maybe quite as much of a filled out characteristic as these decks do, but it is a playable deck. I think it just misses some of the, you know, power in the deck. It could have used another raid in this deck. I'm not sure who it would have been. I know some people play, you know, a Lancelot package in it, but I'm trying to stay true to what this deck is and running the king out onto the board. I do think that this deck is very rush heavy and really cool, but it just needs something a little heavier in the top end. But it is, you know, a lot more playable than these decks. Like you could play this deck and be like, okay, I know what this deck's kind of trying to do. It's got a theme. It's got some raid targets. It's got some plays that it can do. So it is a cohesive deck. It just like maybe needs, you know, a top end card that they give. They could give us another like really strong raid card or some 2 action point really strong card in the deck. Then I could see it being up here with, you know, good solid Union Arena deck. It is a cool deck. I like the deck a lot. I have it built straight Britannia, and it's cool. I don't always win a lot of games, but it's a deck and it's fun. It's cohesive. It doesn't feel as bad as these 3 decks out here where I feel like these are, you know, kind of hard to play or feel like you're playing the game. But going reverse, we'll go back to Hunter and we'll touch on the Bomber. This is a really good, strong deck. I do think that this deck needs a pilot, though, which I think is the issue with this deck. It takes a lot of people. The skill cap with this deck is really high, and so that means that it won't do well in a lot of big tournaments. But I can foresee a lot of people with this deck, you know, running their locals over. I see a lot of in the servers, the community talking about like, oh, we have a blue bomber player and he always does really well and it's a really strong deck. It is a really good deck, but the pilot of the deck matters a lot. So I'll put it on the lower end, I guess, in these decks. But these decks are all kind of the same. They're good decks. They have a theme. They're strong. They do what they can do. If any of these decks, you know, get their pace going before some of the top decks, you could definitely win the game. Say some of these top decks brick a little bit or they're just a little bit slower starting off. Any of these decks can beat them and put them in a bad spot. That's why they're here. They're strong, really good decks. Going down, JJK again. Same thing along the lines of the Mahito, but I do think that I'm a big believer in Mahito. I think that a lot of people didn't show up Mahito, and I do think the high roll for Mahito is really, really good. I don't think that it takes as much to, you know, practice and like really, you know, build a good rapport with the deck to perform super well with as maybe some of the other decks do, like the Gon and the Bomber. But it is a really strong deck, super good. Someone will top with this deck and then put everyone else on the map with it, because this deck is, if you've ever gotten ghettoed on the turn 3 and you've seen that play done against you, you would start respecting this deck. I promise you, because it is nasty when this deck pops off early on you. It's a really cool, strong deck. I like this deck a lot. Definitely a good deck to build if you're wanting to get into a more control-y, playing around with your cards type of deck. Really cool, fun deck for sure. going down, we did JJK. We'll go into Demon Slayer again, and we'll touch up on the Hashiras. This is the Hashira meeting card. It is a good deck. It's a deck, and I think that we need to wait until the community and other people kind of really break this deck down. I think there is a lot of resources in this deck, a lot of really cool things that you can do, but there's so many Hashiras that I think that someone is going to crack the code on which ratios to run each of them, and then this deck will be really, really strong. But I think at the moment, if I had to recommend a deck that is, you know, good and really well thought out to play, it has some aspects of being cohesive with a package, but maybe not as straightforward as these decks, because this deck doesn't have any raid targets, which makes it a little harder to play. But it is a really good, strong, control-y deck. But like I said, I'm trying to rate these in a sense of like cohesiveness of a deck, easiness to play, all these things kind of come into it. And I think that this deck is definitely stronger than a Mertedia deck. I'll put that out there. And this deck has some high end with the Love Hashira being able to clear the board, and the Mist Hashira helping you out, and then the Stone Hashira being able to swarm the board. It is a really good, cool, cohesive deck. I want to put it up here in this one, but I think it takes too much of people trying to figure out how to build it first before I could like really put it up here, because these are definitely, you know, decks that have raids, have ways to play through the game, other than, you know, Gojo over here. And this deck is kind of like a little slower than that. But I think that if you curve out perfectly in a lot of games, which is asking a lot in any deck, if you curve out perfectly, then you can compete with a lot of decks. But it is a cool deck. If you love Hashiras, build this deck. You won't be disappointed. You're going to do some really cool things. And then other games, you're not going to do anything at all. But really cool deck. I like the Hashira decks for sure. Right, going down to Bleach, we will touch up on Ichigo, Renji Rush, however you want to build it. These decks are definitely in the meta decks, really strong, cool decks for sure to build. They've been around since the start of the game here in NA for us. They're really cool, strong decks. I separated them here. Like I said, I'm trying to get all the different types of decks that I can think of possible on this list. If you want to group these together, you can, because the list will be a lot of the same. But some differences for sure. Meta decks, super strong. Love to see it. Going to Green Bleach, this is the one focused on him. I do think that this deck is a really good deck. Now that I'm kind of filling out, this deck is strong. I like this deck a lot. It's a cohesive deck. I definitely think that it can do some cool things. I think it's just missing that top end that gives it that push. But if you're looking for a cool control-based deck to play, this deck feels really cohesive. It feels like a deck. You kind of know what you're doing. You're playing the Unoharas. You're trying to, you know, bring him out. You're trying to have a certain amount of the court guards out. You're trying to tap your opponent's board down. So it is a really cohesive, good deck. I like it a lot. You definitely should not feel bad about building this deck. If you're looking to get into the Union Arena trading card game and you want to build a Bleach deck and you want to build green, this is the deck for you for sure. Going back reverse, we will get Muzan, one of my favorite characters from Demon Slayer, the bad guys. This deck definitely has a theme, and I like the deck a lot, but I do think that it's crazy because I like this deck a lot, and I think that is a strong deck, but I think the way you build this deck matters a lot, and I think the pilot matters a lot, and I don't feel like it's so cohesive enough to where these other decks are and has kind of a theme that you can kind of get lost along the way trying to get there. It is very simple in the fact that you are just trying to get to the Muzan, but I do think that a lot of decks that have raid targets and such can kind of push you down to a point to where if you're trying to kill your own bodies, now you don't have blockers, and there's a whole situation with that. But it is a good deck. It's a thought out deck. It's a solid Union Arena deck that you won't feel bad about playing, but not as fast or cohesive as these decks here, and definitely not able to compete with the meta decks, to say the least. And that's kind of the same spot. I think I'll put, you know, blue, hunter, but with the Killua package and the Biskies and stuff like that. This deck, I like it a lot. I built it for my brother. He likes the deck. A couple people that we know have played with this deck and like it too. But it is hard to pilot. I will say that. It takes a good pilot knowing the deck, but it is a cohesive deck, so I kind of want to bump it up for that. But it is missing maybe, I don't know, like a 6-drop, 2 action point card that comes out, maybe kills some stuff. It needs a little something, you know, there on that top end. But it is a cohesive deck. It has some raid targets, so a little faster than what these guys got going on. A little bit better high end than the Green Britannia deck, but it is a cool, fun deck. If you built this deck, you would not be disappointed. You'd have a lot of fun. It's a good Union Arena deck, cohesive. Just missing a little bit, something here or there. Maybe we get another specified card that'll kind of help it out, or maybe some top end that'll make the deck a little bit stronger. But you definitely would watch out for this deck. If you see this, like any of these decks right here, are good decks that you could lose to that are strong, cohesive decks. Going to Ashford Academy, this deck is really strong. I know a lot of people believe in this deck, and it has topped some tournaments along with the Gojo. But I do think that part of this deck is a surprise factor. But a little more consistent than Gojo and Mahito. So I will put it in the 1 tier. It can place in a tournament. I think that if your opponent knows how to play through this deck and block enough and you kind of miss out, if this deck doesn't get rolling early, you get smashed hard. So the ratios to like how well this deck plays consistently, I think is a little not talked about enough. A lot of people talk about how strong it is, how you can come out, swing, bring another person up, swing, boost someone to your 3,000 to restand it when you play it out for rush or whatever. But it's got a little more going on. Those plays aren't as like, straightforward as you think. And then if you don't see some of your, 2,000 players, it's not as consistent as I think a lot of people think. It is really strong, and I think it is an awesome deck. I like this deck a lot, and it can definitely place in tournaments. And if you build this deck, you'll have a lot of fun playing it because you're just rushing your opponent down. Really strong, awesome deck, Ashford Academy. Going reverse, we are going to talk about the Spiders. And this deck, it's a cool deck. It is strong. A lot of people love this deck. It definitely has a theme going on, so it's a cohesive deck. I think it's just missing out on some pace in the game, for sure. People love this deck, and I think it has to do with like how likable the characters are, but it needs some more raid targets. It needs a little something else to kind of help it out. I think that this deck is just waiting for a perfect time to like get its code cracked, maybe gets a couple cards here and there and really pops off, but it is, a cohesive deck enough to be put in, down here where it doesn't need a ton of help, but it could use a little bit. All these decks down here kind of need a little bit more help to be like, feel really good to play. All these decks at here and up feel really good to play. Let's go back down. We will do green bleach again, and I do think that this one performs a little bit better than the yellow bleach decks. Not by a lot, but it does have a theme if you can get there, and it is consistent, so I will put it here for sure. If you get to him and you move all your characters up and you're able to swing out and through, it feels really, really good. But I think the deck has an issue with just trying to get to that point. It's not as consistent as these other green, big stick decks, just swinging at your opponent with some 5,000, 4,000 drops. It just takes a little bit more to get there. It's not as easy to pilot, but I will say it has a lot more pieces than some of these decks. But it's just not as fast and low. If you could just play this version of the deck and feel a little bit better, I promise you. But it is a really good deck in Union Arena. Better than these down here where I don't think that it needs as much help, but it is missing something just like how all these decks are here. Going back up and through, we will... Nobara, she does a lot of things. I just put Nobara here as a deck because she gets played in Gojo. She gets played in Megumi. But her alone, I think that if you were trying to build a deck just based around her, you would have to run other stuff. So with that being said, I'll put her here because I think that she relies on other packages. So if you're trying to talk about a straight Nobara deck herself, she is missing some things, right? But it is, you're running Nobara, you're running Pandas, you're running Gojos. It's not really like a super fleshed out themed deck to where you're running Toto and that's who you're running, and you kind of run a couple other things, but he's your main target. She's kind of like a Swiss Army knife for the Union Arena trading card game, so I'll definitely put her, in this kind of tier where you can just build Nobara, build some other cool cards around with her. You'll have a really fun, cool deck that you can win some, local tournaments with and stuff like that. But I don't think that it is gonna beat a lot of these top tier meta decks, only because her stun effect kind of gets countered by a lot of these decks that can just raid over their cards and not have to worry about that, where raiding over your cards, new cards, so not affected by her anymore, but really good, strong core kind of principle to build the decks around. Going to the Four Holy Swords deck, the Toto deck. This deck is really cool. I like this deck a lot. I think this deck is slept on. I think it's up, like, someone could do something really cool with this deck, but if I go off based off the basis of, like, it needing it maybe needs a little bit more of a top end in the deck to like really punish your opponent, but it does swarm the board really fast. It's a really cool strong deck. It has some raid targets that you can go into, and you can really put some work out. I play this deck pretty often at my locals, and I've been able to do some crazy things with swinging with a lot of characters, unsuspending one, boosting them all. If you don't know what this deck does, you can really get surprised by it. If you ever play against it, kill the Totos. Don't let them ever keep a Toto on the board and you'll be fine. But it is a really cool, complete Union Arena deck. You won't feel bad about playing this deck. Definitely a really fun deck. Pizza deck. This deck is cool. It has a theme. I like pizza a lot, but I do think that I wish it had, a couple more pieces, but it's not like needing help like these decks where it's unplayable. I think it's a playable, cool deck, but maybe just missing a top end, kind of where all these decks are at. Down here, where you can build the deck and it's fun and the payoff is good, because it plays a lot like Muson, but maybe a little more consistent and the payoff is a little bit better. I like this deck a lot. Really cool deck. If you like gimmicky kind of decks like that, play this deck, and you'll have a lot of fun doing it. I promise you. It's a cool deck. Good deck to build. Going down, we're getting to the bottom here, and we got our boy Megumi. I've been disappointed with how Megumi has performed, but it is a cohesive, really good, cool deck. So if I go based off of that in the card game, I'll put him. He does a little bit more than what the fighter deck does, but I think that he is just a little more popular and gets played more. Whereas both of these decks kind of do some very similar things. I really do think that if you ever get the chance to play this deck, and say you like Megumi decks, please try the Toto Four Sword deck. You will kind of see the similarities there. It's a cool deck. I do think that it's waiting for a really strong good pilot to top in a tournament, and that's where I think like all these decks are here, where I'm going to take this one down. I do like this build of the deck. I built it for style, but having to run so many of the 2 action points, it makes the deck a little slower, and I'm trying to even this out to kind of make a little more, rudimentary-ish kind of stuff. And with that being said, the last deck we're going to put on here is Tengen. It's definitely a deck. I think it has, some cool things going for it. The Tengen payoff feels really good at times, and then other times you just don't see the raid Tengen and you can't do a lot. But I did just post a deck profile where I think I kind of got this deck figured out. I put in a Nosuke package since you're already running some of Nosuke's for the disguise, and I think that helps this deck out a lot. But I wouldn't foresee this deck kind of like topping in a tournament or getting a place in a tournament, where I think, these decks definitely will, and some of these decks could. I think that he's just missing some consistency, because his wives don't have triggers other than one of them. They nerfed him there. If his wives just had triggers like a draw or a get trigger, this deck would be way more cohesive and feel like a better play of a deck than what it is. But this is kind of how I feel like the Union Arena trading card game decks are looking. These 3 decks are the only 3 that I would recommend you not really trying to build or play at the moment. All of these you could build and maybe have a fun time doing it and a good time. Maybe not always win, but get to do what you want to do. These are all some decks here where they are complete cohesive decks. They kind of have a theme. They're maybe just missing a piece or 2 here to make into like a really top tier kind of meta deck. These 3 decks I do think that are on the cusp of being like meta decks, and I do think that these would be in the meta. These are kind of ones I'm just on the cusp of whether they will be meta or not. Really, like, this tier shouldn't exist and it should just be meta. But I don't want to put these 3 into the meta tier, because I definitely want to make the distinction of where these 2 don't have anything proven yet. But I would assume after I make this video, when I go to do like a tier list, competitive tier list breakdown for Union Arena, these 2 will be in that video. A lot of these other decks will not be in there. Oh, I moved someone by accident. But these 3 will be in that list. All these decks right here will be in that list. So I guess it's to talk about like that way. Maybe, half of these decks would be in the competitive tier list when I go to make it. But please let me know what you guys think about this. This video has been fun. I just kind of wanted to give everybody an idea of where I think, the Union Arena trading card game is in such a good spot because there's so many decks that you can play. Even these decks down here, if you want to build them and play them, you will have fun at the game. You may not always win all the time, but this game does a great job of, making all the decks feel like they have the personality of our characters in the anime. And I think that's the best part of this game, feeling like, you're playing with, Toto and you're boogie woogie in, and it feels that way in the game. Or you're playing with C2 and you're trying to get the pizza. She loves pizzas. It feels very thematic and really cool on theme. This game offers a lot in that kind of experience. And then I just wanted to kind of give you guys a little breakdown of where I think building aspect, feel good about building a lot of these decks, and the game is in such a great spot. And this video is just for fun. I will do like a competitive tier list. I know that's what a lot of people like to see, but this is just kind of a breakdown. I wanted to touch off on anything I could think about in the card game and kind of put it in a spot so that way some of these decks aren't missed out on. If we only did competitive tier list videos, no one would ever see some of these decks down here at the bottom and like kind of where they get. And I just wanted to touch on all of them because every deck deserves its place in the game. Some are definitely way more meta and more high tier than others down here, but the game is awesome. I love playing the game. Please, in any of the servers, if you see me on there and want to catch a game, don't be afraid to message me, but please share this video. I am having so much fun making these videos. Share the video, leave in the comments down below what you liked about this video. If I listed one of your decks on here and you're upset about where I kind of put it, or if I didn't touch on your deck even, that's the main thing I want to see is like what decks are out there I kind of forgot, because I really tried to do a lot of research on what we have in the game right now. But yes, subscribe to the channel, please share this video, let me know what you like. My name is Xander Rogue. I'll post some deck list profiles I'm sure to come. Thank you everyone for hanging out with me. Peace.